Today's story is a little bit more freeform than some of the other ones I've done. When I had written it down in my book, I've kind of made a series of notes about particular traditions that I've encountered as I've gone around. But it kind of is also a nice build-up for one of my own stories, so it's a little bit longer than usual, but hopefully you'll stick with me. So, when I say traditions and rituals, they're kind of a globally known thing, like Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, everybody knows what they are. Some are a little bit more country-specific, like one I encountered in Denmark, Pembersvend, I believe it's pronounced, which is the tradition of throwing cinnamon at people if they reach a particular age and they're still unmarried. There's another one in Spain, La Tomatina, where on the last Wednesday of August each year, there's a town there that essentially has a massive food fight with tomatoes. Fantastic. Then there's kind of personal traditions, personal ones that won't really mean much necessarily to anybody else, but may mean more to yourself. Yes, I would suppose you would probably include things like birthdays and anniversaries as they reoccur each year, but then something down to something small, like, if you'd ever gone to an interview and you always had like a lucky bracelet, a lucky tie, or a token for a particular event. And that's kind of where my story for today's one lies. It's kind of a little bit more of a personal one for me. So, when my father left the Air Force, he got his first job in Civvy Street, as he used to call it. He became a truck driver for the General Electric company, GEC. Now, yes, admittedly, he did put on a few pounds as he migrated from a military lifestyle to a more comfortable family life. My dad was my hero growing up. He was home most evenings for dinner. He'd play games with me. He helped me out with disciplining myself with both studies and kind of teaching me to kind of care about other people. So he used to help out a lot in the neighbourhood, even for fundraising for school events, for example. He always used to run like the school barbecue, or if the art department needed a new shelf, he would kind of build. He had his own little workshop, and he would build the shelf, for example. I kind of just wanted to be like him, which kind of mean that I admittedly kind of adopted his appearance too. Now, I've never really minded being a big guy, and honestly, as far back as I can remember, I always have been. I haven't let it stop me really from doing anything. But despite my size, I was still an active kid. I've always loved swimming to help clear my mind. I used to play rugby and hockey for my hometown as well. In fact, I've still got my old hockey sticks back in storage. I always found it satisfying to channel all my strength and shift my weight behind like a single shot. But admittedly, I was like that guy, Fulton, I think his name was, in the Mighty Ducks. He couldn't move for toffee, but blimey, did he whack the crap out of a shot. I went all the way through Beavers, Cubs and Scouts movement when I was a kid. I loved hiking, walking, and it taught me the kind of importance of both being independent when you need to, and as well as asking help when you need to as well. Eventually, I actually returned to my original Beavers troop, and then Cub troop, and then actually also the Scout troop as well, and helped them out under the alias of Baloo for a few years as well. I kind of migrated through the whole thing. The return to the Scout movement coincided with me also kind of enrolling with the Duke of Edinburgh program while I was in school. Reflecting back on it, I'd say it was one of my most memorable experiences back in school. Now, just to explain a bit, just to explain what the Duke of Edinburgh is, just in case you hadn't heard of it, because it's not really a globally known program. The Duke of Edinburgh program was more of a mid to late teens challenge. I think once you'd reached your mid-20s, you weren't actually eligible to even do it anymore. But it's a combination of volunteering community work, which my kind of scout service contributed towards anyway, then personal skill development, which, as I was still in school while I was doing it, it counted towards that sort of side of it. And then there was also physical skills. So it normally involves some sort of expedition somewhere or a series of activities as well. For example, I think the bronze level we did over a weekend, we climbed Mount Snowdon over in Wales, along with some kayaking and abseiling. What else was there? Yeah, but basically it was all things that I had experience with, thanks mainly to actually the Cubs and Scouts movement. It was during my expedition for the silver level of the Duke of Edinburgh that one of my own little traditions was kind of born. Now, the expeditions in the Duke of Edinburgh weren't really something you kind of just decided to go out and do one weekend. They required quite a deal of planning, quite a degree of planning. This was kind of in an age before mobile phones, I should add, and satellite navigation. Yes, it did exist, but it wasn't really on a personal, individual level. You know, you would be a truck driver and you would have GPS for your truck, and you were in a very good company if that was the case. So a lot of the Duke of Edinburgh navigation was all by maps, compass, and if you were doing any night travelling, it was also by the stars too. Depending on where you were in the world, you may have had to have considered doing that as well, although in some places it wasn't exactly a requirement. Our silver crew actually consisted of 5 people in total, and an assessor as well. And because it was a nationwide program, it was actually made up of students from other schools as well. So while I went to a all-boys school, we actually also had 2 girls from the local all-girls school in our group as well. And I think we spent months, in all honesty, of after school time together, prepping, and each of us kind of learning strengths and weaknesses of everybody else. But, you know, we had a lot of good book-smart people in our group, but the kind of not huge amounts of hands-on experience. We had navigational experience, botanical experience, animal kind of biology, watch out for this kind of creature experience, first aid. We had a couple that were good at repairing, cooking. Not to mention, we just kind of all really kind of melded really well as a group. We just got to the point where we were all really just on the same page. We knew what needed to happen and just got on with it. Sometimes didn't even have to say anything. We just kind of knew what needed to be done. Like setting up camp. You arrive, you put up your tent, someone goes out and gets wood. It was just a thing. People just would go and do it. Now, one of the girls in the group, Aurora, she didn't have great upper body strength. So I agreed that I would take on the expedition her tent and her spare boots. Now, despite my size, I've never really had an issue with strength. Give me a pair of walking boots and a bag and I'll carry whatever's needed. But in turn, she would carry my food. The idea being that as time went on and we ate more, that her bag would become increasingly lighter, whereas mine would kind of stay at a same level all the way through. Anyway, fast forward to expedition day. We actually ended up hiking over in Austria. Everyone during the DFE had the same kind of starting and end points, but it was down to each individual group to kind of plan their route as to how they did the journey. So it was simple choices by map. You could go up and down a small mountainous area, or kind of stay low, follow rivers, marsh and woodland, or even just take the route walking by the road. But walking next to the road is just too easy, too simple. If you're following the road, you're never going to get lost, nor are you going to get the chance to even see most of the countryside, which, you know, is kind of half the point of doing the expedition in the first place. Anyway, in the end, our group decided that we were going to try and do a bit of everything. We figured the first day we were going to be well rested and kind of full of energy, so it made climbing up a little bit more appetizing to do. And then the second day would follow the river down the mountain, and then by day 3 there was a river that would follow. We would follow through a local woods, and it eventually lead us to a road that was about an hour away from where we finished. So we had set ourselves reasonable goals each day for progress as well. So the mountain distance was short, but it obviously would take time, given that it was all upwards climbing and it would probably be fairly rocky terrain. Whereas day 2 was going to be mostly downhill and flat, so we could progress a lot faster. Now, one of the things that obviously maps won't show you on the wilderness was where we'd find suitable campsites. Yes, you have designated campsites, but when you're out the wilderness, not always. So we kind of gave ourselves an extra hour each day, just in case we needed to go on a little bit further, or if we could, or if we needed to stop at an hour early because we found a good spot, then absolutely fine. So the first day went without much of a hitch. We made good progress. In fact, we actually started our descent in search for a suitable campsite on the first day. But everyone was kind of tired enough that by the end of the first day, we were all in kind of good spirits, but we were ready to call it a day. The night was breezy. The tents really whistled and rattled a lot, but it was nothing any of us weren't expecting. We were all kind of prepared for it. We had agreed to take it in turns as to who would navigate, so everyone could have a kind of go each day. And day 2 morning, for the safe travelling down the mountainside, was my duty. It was easy enough. I tended to enjoy navigating a lot more by the way that pilots navigate, which, if you're not familiar with, it's generally they look at landscape and they look at key points on maps. So that church over there, that river there, that mountain there, everything you'd see on a map top down is generally the way that pilots actually navigate as well, or used to navigate. I think light pilots generally still do now. But all I needed to do was basically find a river, and that would lead us to where we needed to go by the end of the day. I got us down the hill, and unfortunately we were hit by kind of a bit more boggy marshland and wetland kind of area. It was Orin, one of the other guys in the group, turned to take over once I had gotten us down. But regardless of the boggy conditions anyway, we decided that between all of us that we'll make our way through the bog. I think it was by that time we had gotten through it. Yeah, I think it was by the time we had gotten through it that unfortunately we were kind of behind in our time, and everyone with wet boots wasn't great. Aurora had also unfortunately had fallen in the bog, and let's just say the smell wasn't particularly pleasant to the extent where it was quite memorable. But again, it kept everyone in good spirits. We all laughed it off. The bog eventually became the woodland where we were going for kind of setting up the camp anyway. So we decided to, once we had reached the end of it, to stop and set up camp for the night. That evening, I was getting my camp stove ready. My pan was oiled and heated, but was probably about 5 paces, I'd say, away from my tent. The woodland nearby had actually kind of sheltered us from the wind, so we were actually able to get out our stoves, whereas before we ended up having like MREs, meals ready to eat, out of the bag, because the higher breeze up on the mountainside had really reduced the ability to go out and make a fire. So this was kind of the night that we'd have our hot food. So Aurora had come across to collect her dry boots from my bag after setting up her tent. And when she was over, she explained to me that she was having problems with getting her stove working, and asked if I wouldn't mind having a look for her. I agreed, and she went back to her tent to get it. Problem solving is something I've always enjoyed doing. My mind seems to just have this built-in ability to want to break everything apart and figure out the way things work and fix it if I can. It was kind of my skill in the group. I was the problem solver. So while Aurora went back to get her stove for me to have a look at, I returned inside my tent to pick up some dry socks for myself, because obviously my boots were also soaked through. Now Aurora returned with her gas canister in hand, and while I was having a look, I asked if she wouldn't mind going back to her tent to obviously grab some of the food rations from her bag for me to cook while I take a look. So as she left, I took a closer look at the stove and the canister. Now, the problem was easy enough to diagnose. The top wasn't really screwed on properly, so the canister ball bearing inside was only partially open, so it just needed unscrewing and reattaching. But what I hadn't realised at that time is it had quietly been leaking. The gas trail leading from outside to inside my tent then decided that it was going to be, at that moment, catch fire! Boom! Fireball! So it caught fire from my cooking stove outside. The gas had kind of trailed from the outside of my tent. It didn't go back to her tent. I was obviously inside my tent, so I couldn't see how far it went back, but needless to say, I'll tell you more about that in a second. But the gas trail leading inside my tent caught fire, and the cooking stove in my hand essentially exploded. A fireball engulfed my hand, my arm that was holding the gas canister, and within seconds my tent was also on fire. The gas had filled up the inside of my tent, and it was also on fire. So shock kind of kicked in, and I briefly panicked. The front of my tent was still open at the time, so I jumped out of my now on fire world and into the open, not on fire space in front of me. My fire training from the scout days did kind of kick in. It did take a few seconds, but it did kick in, and I did start rolling, by which time the rest of my team that was around did kind of come over and helped put me out, I guess. But yeah, it so much rushed through my head in those moments that the pain of it all at that time didn't even register. Recalling it back now does make me smile, because I vividly remember that one of the things that crossed my mind at that time, it probably meant that I was going to fail the Duke of Edinburgh certification. Never mind the bigger picture of just the fact that I would just been on fire and I'm still alive. But yeah, I thought I was going to fail the Duke of Edinburgh. It was the most ridiculous thing. So Jared was the first aider in our group, one of the other guys. He soaked a towel from his own bag in water from the camp as well, and wrapped me in it, or wrapped my arm in it as well. The assessor that was with us the entire time as well was with us, but I think he was in just as much shock as I was. but it was amusing that the teenagers were calmer about the whole experience and the designated adult in the group wasn't. I lost all the hair on one side that was closest to the fire, along with what I'd later to discover was actually secondary burns all along my arm and hands that I had the canister in. I was in quite a bit of pain at the time, but the assessor in the group did have painkillers with him, which he ended up giving to me. Combined with the cold wet towel on my arm, it seemed to do the trick of kind of keeping the pain under control. Despite the concerns of the rest of the group, the assessor decided that we were going to wait and decide what we were going to do in the morning instead. So Aurora ended up offering a spot in her tent for that evening for myself. The assessor had a spare sleeping bag, which he had given to me. Don't ask why. He just happened to have one. While most of the tent had burnt down, fortunately enough, not everything was kind of destroyed in it. I had a roll-up mat underneath my sleeping bag to kind of even out the surface, and it had parts of my bag melted into it, but it was still usable. I've actually kept this as a memento. I've got it back in storage, and my clothes that were in the tent were also singed, but were in better condition than the kind of PVC and waterproofs that I had half melted into my leg and arm. I put them on when we went through the kind of marshy woodlands area. So I kind of carefully changed out from one set of clothes into the other, even though the other clothes were still slightly burnt. They were still in a better condition. Both Aurora and I weren't really in much of a condition to eat after that. She felt sick to the stomach because she thought that she was the cause of all this grief, despite both of the other people in the group and I attempting to reassure her that it was completely an accident. That wasn't the case. I was still too shaken up to eat. Everyone in the group was concerned, but we decided to kind of move on past it and make the final push in the morning. So to no great shock, I couldn't sleep. Any contact with dry clothing on my skin gave me quite intense pain, so I attempted to sleep on top of the sleeping bag with the burn areas exposed to the cold air or wrapped in the wet towel. I had so much running through my head. I was concerned that the biggest thing was that I was going to let the group down. I was concerned if I was going to have any scars. I had never shared a tent with someone as well, let alone someone that felt guilty being the cause of the pain that I was in. So I was kind of conscious of their issues too. It just wasn't going to happen. It was even just something as simple as, even though if I had failed the Duke of Edinburgh, yes, you could have the possibility of doing it again, but it was the cost of going to another country. It was the fact that I'd have to wait another year for it to all happen. There was just so much running through my head. Anyway, we both needed something to distract us and get us through the night. Inside her tent, I had noticed a book, and it was named The Colours of Magic. Now, for those that aren't aware, it's the first book in the Discworld series by the author Terry Pratchett. I was aware of the author at the time, purely by name rather than anything else, but had never really read any of the books. And I asked her if she had read it yet, and she hadn't, but Aurora had brought the book along to read if any of the evenings were quiet or wet, and she'd retreat back to her tent. So I hadn't bought a book along myself, as I figured I'd be too tired to read in the evenings, that I'd just probably drift off to sleep anyway. So I asked if she wouldn't mind reading it out for the both of us. So there it was. For the next few hours, she read through the book before eventually drifting off herself, and I was then relaxed knowing that she was at rest, and I was then tired enough to get a bit of shut-eye then myself. The next day, we packed up camp, and we made it to town without much of a hitch for midday. Fortunately, I didn't have to worry about then carrying a bag, because most of my stuff was then burnt down. On the final walk into town, I was speaking to the assessor, and asked him to be frank to find out if I'd failed the group with what had happened. He said that despite everything that had happened, that it was an accident and he saw no reason to fail the group, and that we worked really well as a team and completed the goal of the expedition itself. So once we got into town, I was actually taken to hospital. I was reassessed by the other assessors, who ended up calling an ambulance that morning instead of actually taking me to hospital. The ambulance ended up taking me to hospital. But I ended up spending the night overnight the local hospital. But Aurora was allowed up that evening and continued reading the book for us both. And I guess my own tradition was then born. Every time I'd go away, regardless of where it was I was going, I'd always pack a fantasy book or some sort of non-fiction book. Not always with the intention of reading it myself, or necessarily at all, but you never know when it would be just the thing that I or somebody else would need.